Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to see so many faces here and online, and what a week to celebrate the Center for Public Health and Human Rights and its leaders. Can't imagine a more, yeah? Is it not working? That is, maybe it's where I'm standing. Maybe it's where, okay, how's that? Okay. I just wanted to say what a week it has been to celebrate the Center for Public Health and Human Rights and its leaders. And I really can't imagine a time more important to do so. It's just an opportunity to shine a light on the important work that the center and its leaders do. And I'm really thrilled today to celebrate Len Rubenstein. And it's great to welcome so many folks to celebrate his work. You know, when I saw Len at the 2-2 celebration earlier this week, he actually said, "It's lovely that you're doing this. Why are you doing this? It's very sweet." I think he said that to me again. And that's exactly why we do this, Len, because of your humility and your grace in the face of all that you've accomplished and the public health leadership that you've shown across your career, your commitment to public health. That is why we celebrate you. Len is really a shining example of what I think makes the department so special, the Department of Epidemiology. So we are not just a department of trained epidemiologists, we're a department of physicians, of engineers, of social scientists, and lawyers, all coming together with really a common goal, improving the public's health, and in Len's case, human rights and justice for all. So you're going to hear a lot of talk today and a lot of the details about Len's career and his accomplishments. So I'm not going to go through all of those myself, just to say that Len is trained as a lawyer. And if you look at his pedigree and his accomplishments before he came here, he really lived a whole career before he came to Hopkins and was recruited, I think, in 2009 by Chris Byrer. But he had a second career, I guess I would say here, and was appointed as a distinguished professor of the practice in 2023 and served as the interim director of the Center for Public Health and Human Rights. I think that many in our department don't necessarily even have an idea of all the work that Len has done in his career. Again, not just in the time that he's been a faculty member in our department, but in the work that he did prior to coming here. Even I can say that I only learned of the scope of it more recently. But I'll say that it's remarkable, and it's addressed some of the most challenging issues, right? Everything from torture, conflict, refugee, and migrant health. His work is really about highlighting abuses and advocating for solutions. Work, again, that has never been more important than it is now. Len has won a number of awards across his career, and again, I'm sure you'll hear about some of those today. One in particular is special to me, and that is the 2024 Carl E. Taylor Lifetime Achievement Award in international health from the American Public Health Association. Much in the tradition of the great Carl Taylor, Len is a public health giant who fights the hard fight, stands up for those who may not be able to stand up for themselves, and really, I think, sets an example for all of us. So Len, I just want to thank you for doing the work that you've done for your whole career, for taking a chance on a Department of Epidemiology, and really serving as an example for all of us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Shruti, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrea Wirtz. I'm faculty in the Department of Epidemiology and the Center for Public Health and Human Rights, and I'm happy to be jointly organizing this with the department. And I want to begin by welcoming everyone here in person and on Zoom. Today, particularly Len's family, who's joining us both in person. Margaret is here, and his family, his mother, his sister, his daughter, his son are joining us on Zoom as well. I would also like to take a moment to thank our department, our chair, Dr. Shruti Mehta, the vice chair for faculty, Dr. Priya Dugal, for generously hosting this event in recognition of Len's work. and to our former chair, Dr. David Celentano and Dr. Chris Byer, for taking a leap and welcoming Len to the Department of Epidemiology. These events provide a wonderful opportunity to reflect on the careers of many of the department's impressive faculty, and Len is one of them. Len is a lawyer whose career has spanned human rights, health, and bioethics. He received his legal training at Harvard Law School in 1975 and Master of Laws in Georgetown University Law Center in 1976. His career in health and human rights began with a focus on mental health, where he began his career as staff attorney for the Mental Health Law Project in Washington, D.C. in the 1980s, which ultimately advanced to a role as the executive director throughout the 1990s. He jointly authored the ACLU Handbook on Rights of People with Mental Disabilities that was published in 1996. From there, he became the executive director and then president of Physicians for Human Rights, where he served for over a decade. In that role, he led extensive efforts to document and address medical complicity in torture, leading a task force on professionalism in national security detention centers, and authoring the book Ethics Abandoned: Medical Professionalism and Detainee Abuse in the War on Terror. Under his leadership, Physicians for Human Rights was a member of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, which received the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1997. He then became the Jennings Randolph Senior Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace before ultimately joining us at the Bloomberg School of Public Health in 2009. Here at Johns Hopkins, Len served as the interim director of the Center for Public Health and Human Rights and as core faculty in the Center of Humanitarian Health and the Berman Institute of Bioethics. He has instructed several courses, including Human Rights and Health Professional Practice, Bioethics, Human Rights and Global Health, Current Issues in Human Rights, and Health in Prisons, amongst others. His work now focuses particularly on the protection of health facilities, patients, and health workers in situations of conflict. And he advances refugee and migrant health and rights and exploring ethical responsibilities of health professionals to advance human rights. He most recently founded and chairs the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition. Through that coalition, he has tirelessly and successfully advocated for the World Health Organization to begin monitoring attacks on healthcare. He wrote the book Perilous Medicine: The Struggle to Protect Healthcare from Violence of War in 2021, and his efforts have been recognized by numerous awards over the decade. As Shruti mentioned, most recently the 2024 Carl E. Taylor Lifetime Achievement Award in International Health from the American Public Health Association. I personally have had the privilege to know and learn from Len since he joined us in 2009. He has been a kind colleague, generous with his time and knowledge, and a trusted friend in this work. In his work here, but what I think is true throughout his career, Len has steadfastly worked to bring attention to human rights abrogations that impact public health, as well as to identify and advocate for solutions to end these abuses. These are all lessons that he imparts to his student advisees and to his colleagues. With that, I'm pleased to introduce you to three colleagues who have worked closely with Len over the course of his career. Our first speaker is Ms. Susanna Sirkin, who is a human rights advocate and former director of policy for the Physicians for Human Rights. Susanna.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And thanks to all of you who are here in the room and on Zoom, and to the department for hosting me and inviting me. I want to just say before I start with my remarks that I'm in solidarity with all of you here today during this very difficult time, but while it's important to pause and celebrate a career. I first met Len when he came to Boston for a job interview at Physicians for Human Rights in 1996. Our founding executive director and most of our board members were doctors. Len, as you've heard, was a lawyer with an impressive resume, but not much background in our specific field. I had been privileged to participate in the interview and was delighted when Len assented to my invitation to have coffee across from the Boston Common while the board continued meeting in executive session. During our conversation about how to lead PHR from a fledgling but powerful new non-governmental organization into our adolescence and beyond, Len said, "Look, I'm not an international human rights expert, but I can learn. I learn quickly, and he was right. Leonard Rubenstein has made tremendously important contributions to our field and work for 3 decades, and I'm thrilled to be here to honor him today. And this tribute to Len is also a plug for on-the-job training. Many of us received our higher education before there were any human rights programs at universities, let alone in health and human rights. So we all learned by doing back in those early days. Len is an intrepid master of that, which is no doubt why he earned the title of Distinguished Professor of the Practice. And it is a credit to this great institution here that you have embraced Len and his outstanding role at the Academy as a practitioner of human rights. Heaven knows we need more practitioners of human rights today more than ever. And that is also why Len is not going to walk off, as he has jokingly predicted, into the sunset. No way. In fact, some of us here and on Zoom and beyond are a bit anxious about when Len becomes an even bigger nudge to our network of activists once he is unleashed from here. Going back to that interview at PHR 30 years ago, Len was asked to give the elevator speech for our organization. Never an easy task in our case. And Len described PHR as an alliance of science and conscience. Although Len, in characteristic modesty, brushed aside this meme, as we'd now call it, as a fleeting wordsmithing effort, this compelling phrase has stuck with me for decades. Would that we had more conscience in our country right now, with science, as we are all now in a historic battle, both to defend science and to preserve our national and professional conscience. During 10 years of weekly and bi-weekly commutes from Washington, D.C. to Boston, Len led PHR through unforeseeable crises, phenomenal advances, and proud moments. You have been my boss and teacher and true north since that time, Len, as well as a trusted friend and advisor. When Len began as our director in 1996, PHR was completing the investigations and analyses of the largest mass graves ever exhumed for forensic purposes to date, victims of genocidal massacres in Bosnia, Croatia, and Rwanda. It was pioneering work carried out with many dozens of volunteer experts from numerous countries and a large local staff in Bosnia. We had limited funding, we faced overwhelming logistical and scientific challenges, and we were dealing with new and unprecedented international criminal tribunals. Len's leadership, and yes, his legal expertise and savvy were indispensable as we and the prosecutor's office in The Hague, as well as the families of the missing and dead, struggled with the trauma and the evidence, the truth-telling, and forms of redress, the humanitarian need to know, and the justice imperatives in the aftermath of these horrific killings. And years later, the primary perpetrators of many of these atrocities were indeed arrested and brought to justice. Len taught us to focus on real, achievable goals, to keep our eyes on the prize. And within a year of arriving at PHR, he marched in Oslo together with the 5 other founding organizations of the International Campaign to Ban Landmines to receive a literal prize, the Nobel Prize for Peace, following the success of an unprecedented coalition of more than 1,000 organizations on every continent. And I'll just take an aside to honor Dr. Jim Kobe, who was one of the main pioneers in the very first report on landmines in Cambodia that launched the campaign. But these organizations collaborated with like-minded governments led by Canada, that great country to our north, to achieve a global mine ban treaty. The medical and epidemiological information on the health impacts of this egregiously injurious conventional weapon were critical to that groundbreaking campaign. And Len took this combination of qualitative and quantitative methods to make striking innovations in our field, with report after report linking health and human rights and making impact through building a highly respected Washington office. The next year, in 1998, after courageous field research in Afghanistan, PHR issued a compelling report, The Taliban's War on Women, and Len arranged for its launch in Washington, D.C. by none other than First Lady at the time, Hillary Clinton. The report documented how the Afghan Taliban had overtly and intentionally violated the fundamental rights and health of more than half its citizens, women. In the introduction to the report, well before 9/11, PHR also warned of the danger of the Taliban's hosting of Osama bin Laden. And on the morning of September 11th, 2001, as our Boston staff watched in horror the planes crashing into the Twin Towers, Len was on his usual early morning commute from DC to Boston. He was worried about his wife, Margaret, in Alexandria, not that far from the Pentagon, which had also been hit. And Margaret was worried about Len on his flight to Boston, where the flights that hit the towers had originated. Most of us at PHR figured right away that Al-Qaeda was the likely culprit. But we also knew that there would be immediate threats to human rights as the so-called war on terror commenced. Len and I walked in a daze across the Boston Common that evening, understanding that the world as we knew it and our work at PHR were in for some dire changes and daunting challenges. It is important to remember those times today as we gear up for this other devastatingly different and terrifying environment. Len gathered us the next morning, and under his steady and strategic guidance, PHR became one of the foremost and essential organizations to assess all of the brutal enhanced interrogation techniques as torture. And Len led us in launching a campaign by physicians, psychologists, and many others, issuing report after report on the physical and psychological consequences of these illegal practices, the unethical roles of health professionals in their creation and implementation, and the accountability measures required for these gross human rights violations. As the new millennium wore on, Len became a thought leader on the right to health, a right that remained unrecognized and undelivered in the United States since the 1948 adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where rights were meant to be interdependent and indivisible. With a generous 6-year grant from Gates, Len led PHR to galvanize health professionals in calling for prevention and treatment of HIV/AIDS without discrimination as a human rights imperative, promoting the dignity and health of all people, men, women, children, LGBTQ people, survivors of sexual violence, and people living with AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa and the US. And during this period, Len also marshaled medical expertise to oppose the juvenile death penalty, which came to an end in the United States in 2005. Throughout his decade as my boss, Len's investigations in Bosnia, Croatia, Chechnya, Kosovo, the occupied Palestinian territories, Turkey, and Zimbabwe, research, often in partnership with leading scholars, some in this room and on Zoom today, documented the horrific range of attacks on health personnel, hospitals, and patients. As he reveals in his indispensable book, which was just mentioned, Perilous Medicine, in these travels he heard the, quote from the book, anguished stories of health workers who had been arrested, assaulted, shot at, and bombed in hospitals where they worked, of patients attacked in their beds, of clinics looted or forced to shut down under threat, of emergency responders frantically trying to persuade indifferent soldiers to allow patients in dire need to get through checkpoints. Those of you who know this work which has been a hallmark of his time at Hopkins, will understand why it is such a through line of Len's career and why now, more than ever, it must continue. Len is relentless in pursuing accountability for these tremendously cruel violations of human rights and humanitarian law and basic morality, and to understanding their impact on health. The work of the Safeguarding Health in Conflict Coalition, which really wouldn't exist without the tireless leadership of Len, is crucial and urgent as we witness the horrors of attacks on health today in Gaza, in Myanmar, in Sudan, in the Ukraine, and to pursue accountability for these crimes in Syria, among so many others. If I could do a word cloud or phrase cloud for Len, it would include the following: pursuing perpetrators of war crimes without fear or favor, unhesitatingly taking on unpopular and sometimes unfundable issues, idealistic pragmatism, integrity, frugality, sometimes to a fault, rigorous researcher, unsparing editor, generous mentor of generations of activists and students, big brain with a kind heart. Thank you, Len, for your huge contributions to our field, your guidance, your friendship, and a well-deserved mini vacation. Have a nice walk into the sunset, but I know you'll join it in rising up again tomorrow.
Thank you, Susanna. So our next speaker is Dr. Chris Byer. Many of you in the room know Chris. He was formerly a professor in the Department of Epidemiology. He was the founding director of the Center for Public Health and Human Rights, and he is now the director of the Duke Global Health Institute and the Gary Hawk Distinguished Professor in Global Health. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us here today, so he's sent a recording to share with everyone in the room.
Greetings, everyone. I'm so sorry that I can't be there with you all to celebrate the extraordinary achievements and contributions of our beloved Len Rubenstein to Hopkins, to the department, but most importantly for me personally, to the Center for Public Health and Human Rights. Len and I have known each other for many years, from his days as the president of Physicians for Human Rights, and then some 15 years ago now, when we successfully recruited him to Hopkins and to the center. And I remember being asked at the time by the leadership, why do we need a human rights lawyer in the Department of Epidemiology at Hopkins? And these 15 years have given us again and again the answers to that question. And the answer is that there's nothing like someone like Len who really has a deep knowledge and understanding and wisdom about human rights, social justice, health equity, to help us think through these challenging issues. And of course, particularly for the people in our world who are facing the toughest challenges, which is the provision of healthcare in conflict settings. Len established and led our program in health and conflict. Of course, his coalition on healthcare in conflict has become a gold standard for reporting and documenting in this field. And he's also somebody who has taught so many of us about how to do advocacy with the government, our government, with the UN, with the bodies out there that matter and that care about social justice, human rights, and healthcare. So Len, I also want to just personally thank you so much for stepping in as the acting director of the center after my departure from Johns Hopkins to Duke, where I now am, and appreciate your careful stewardship of what the center faculty, staff, and students have built together over these many years. Delighted that Joe Amon, a longtime friend and colleague, has now stepped into that role, and that you get to spend more time with Margaret and your grandchildren. Can't think of anything better. And let me just close by saying that I think, it's not a surprise to anyone that we are facing now an administration in this country and administrations in many countries worldwide that are really averse to the fundamental principles that all lives have equal value, that everyone deserves the minimum standard of health and human rights, and that it's part of our role as public health people to do everything we can to advance health equity and try and address the terrible inequalities in our world. That only means that the work is more important and that the work that you have done for all of these decades to advance human dignity and equity and human health is all the more important. I know you will continue to make contributions. You already have built a magnificent legacy. You have inspired decades now, faculty, students, and staff, people in the NGO world, people in the social justice world. And you've always remained a humble, kind, caring man and colleague. And we love you, and we're going to miss you. And I'm so honored to have been able to work with you through these many years. So wishing you all the best for this next phase of your work, life, and career. And again, my deepest thanks for everything you've contributed. It really has meant a huge difference. Thank you. Greetings, everyone.
Great. And our next speaker today is Dr. Rohini Har. She's an emergency medicine physician and assistant adjunct professor of epidemiology at UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Thank you, Rohini.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to be here today, primarily because I've been prepping to talk about Len for maybe 23 years. And I'm going to start the way I've watched Len start so many talks. If you've heard him, you've probably heard this too. I've got 3 lessons that I've learned from Len over the years that I'd like to share with you. His commitment to excellence, really knowing your stuff, and deeply caring about what you're doing. And I've learned so much more, but they only gave me 10 minutes today. I'm going to rewind back in time to the early days. I started medical school in September of 2001, when the world felt like it had completely changed. And I think it probably feels a little bit like that to you now if you're students. And in the midst of that wild time, people getting their first cell phones, Bush and Rumsfeld throwing folks in Guantanamo, and HIV/AIDS still raging, I was studying medicine really hard, but also finding myself compelled and drawn to doing human rights work. And I first met Len and Susanna when I was fangirling Physicians for Human Rights. I had invited them to Chicago to speak about health and human rights and how medicine, public health, and human rights are ingrained and how they work together. And I remember so well how excited I was to see him speak and how much it inspired me to seek an alternative path. And I think I've been following Len's path since then. I'll fast forward from 2003 when he came to Chicago and I first met him to 2011. In the meantime, I'd moved to New York, finished residency, and was doing a very lengthy MPH at Columbia and trying to find more opportunities to do public health and human rights work. At the same time, Len was organizing a conference in DC. You heard he was a fellow at the USIP. And through a prof there, asked for volunteers. I was very interested. I started working with Len and helping organize this conference at USIP. It was on health in post-conflict and fragile states. And I believe it was just around the time that he was focusing more and more on this topic. We worked on everything together for that conference, the pre-conference paper, the invites, and afterwards, my very first publication. I learned how much work he put into doing things right. He knew every speaker, every panel, every topic, and he made sure it all fit well together. And his dedication to really getting it right really did make for an excellent conference. Of course, I think many of you recognize this building from the Doge tragedy last week, but I'll remember the work done there by Len as a fellow and how he really introduced me to his process. Too far away. So, after that conference, I sent Len my first draft of the paper, and after a week, he sent it to me in track changes. I think Susanna called him an unsparing editor. It was covered in red. This is one of the 20 pages of that paper, like actually fully covered in red. And I'd never gotten feedback like that. I was a good student, you know. My ego took a big hit. But then I realized this is the first time someone cared enough about my writing to read it so closely and put that much effort into making it better. I think we went back forth on that draft 45 times, and in the end, it was solid, and it really showed the care that Len taught me how to put into things and into people. A year later, when a capstone project fell through, it was Len I turned to help me come up with something at the last minute. And even though I was not at Hopkins or in any way associated with his work, he had a new project in Myanmar and he let me do it. And it was looking at documenting attacks on healthcare from across the border in Thailand. And I'm sick of showing depressing pictures of war, so I dragged my child and my mother-in-law there with me. So I worked with Len and his team right here at Hopkins, as well as Court Robinson, on assessing a data collection tool that health workers would use to collect data themselves on the attacks. You see, in Myanmar 13 years ago, the military junta was attacking health and health workers all the time, just as it is now. And without media and open source investigations, the only attacks we really heard of outside of Myanmar were those that were so dramatic that they made it to US news. But to hear it from the perspectives of health workers in Myanmar, their day-to-day experience was just as hard. Threats and intimidation, looting, and then your everyday arrests and detention. I didn't know it then, but I would end up working on protecting health in conflict, working closely with Len from 2013 to now, and that project was really the start. Again, Len showed me he really cared. He helped a bit of a rando, me, start a tiny career, and our work on that research has kept going. The redlining was just as bad on this paper, but I got used to it now. At the end of the year, Len actually helped me move to Berkeley. When I mentioned I was relocating, he introduced me to his old friend Eric Stover, and not only gave suggestions, but he emailed Eric and really made it happen for me. And now I've been at Berkeley's Human Rights Center and at the School of Public Health for 10 years. And even though we've lived across the country all this time, I've been able to support Len's work and work closely together for all these 10 years. And we continue to work on attacks on health. It's not so common that doctors and lawyers get along so well. We're usually afraid of lawyers, but I believe our work really has become complementary. Len understands the law and advocacy so deeply, and I get to dive into the research and local health workers to support that. So let me share a little bit about this topic. As I mentioned, in 2013, our work was focused on field methods for collecting data. And over that time, as the internet and media and open source has grown, we've been able to do so many other ways of collecting data on attacks on health. The report from Safeguarding Health in Conflict shows that there are more than 2,500 incidents of attacks on health in 2023. And the report for 2024 will probably show a similar, if not higher, number. As we were working on this research and he was mentoring me, he also was working separately on advocacy at the UN, demanding more action, and advocated for the World Health Assembly to take on its issue, culminating in a World Health Assembly resolution in 2012. In 2015, with the war in Syria marked more and more by airstrikes against hospitals, we worked on adapting our methods from Myanmar and documenting these attacks in Syria. And while I thought that was the only thing we were doing, He was also working to start the Safeguarding Health and Conflict Coalition with more than a dozen organizations he personally connected with. It was a place to work together on this issue and also to share the data. And this annual report, now with Insecurity Insight, is probably the most cited data on attacks on health every year and a model for many other groups studying how to present data. In 2016, Len's work was part of the powerful advocacy that led to the UN Security Council Resolution 2286, demanding accountability and documentation by the UN. Can you imagine all the members of the Security Council coming together to agree to do this? I mean, it's hard now, and I imagine it was just as hard then. It was no small feat. And since 2019, we've worked on understanding the impacts of these attacks on health services, on health workers, and on the community. And we've done a number of case studies where he's visited as well in Central African Republic, Colombia, Myanmar, and Syria. And while I was busy doing that and he was helping, he also wrote a book. If you haven't read it, go out and find it. He talks not only about his extensive knowledge of this topic, but again, he shows how much he cares. He highlights the stories of our colleagues in Turkey and CAR and Kosovo, really sharing their experiences and the threats and the violence that they faced. And I think that's what makes his book so compelling. Sadly, violence against healthcare is still all too common, and there's much left to do. But as I don't like to quote Winston Churchill, but success consists of going from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. And that's what I see in Len. So we keep up the work. And there's no one else I'd rather be in this work with than Len. He's taught me how important it is to create high quality work to make change, how important it is to become an expert in your field, immersing yourself in the history, the literature, and all the different facets of a topic. And his investment in me and probably many of you students and colleagues over the years is probably the most important lesson I've learned, that with a good mentor, you really can thrive. So thanks, Len, for being the best. And I'm looking forward to having a little bit more time to spend with me on these issues. Your mentorship and expertise and excellence has meant everything to me. I'm feeling so lucky to be here to honor you today. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Rohini. And while it was not the central message, I hope that the students here will also take away that when we heavily edit your manuscripts, it's a sign of love. That is our love language. So we're going to close the session with a few words from Len. Before I hand the mic over to Len, I just want to thank you all for being here today, and also extend an invitation. We have a reception to follow in the Welch West Reading Room, that follows this seminar immediately. So come on over and toast Len and spend some time with friends and enjoy time together. So Len, if you would like to come on up.
I'm so touched by what everyone said. I think generous, over generous. But I have to make a few comments. One, I've been so fortunate in my career, and the opportunities I've had, the mentors I've had, the people who have been role models for me and inspired me. But there's something else too that Susanna mentioned, learning on the job. People who took a flyer on me. I still remember talking to Susanna when I got Physicians for Human Rights. Could you explain to me what international humanitarian law is? Looking back, I am totally embarrassed that I asked such a question, but I did it again. When I came to Hopkins, I asked Chris, can you explain the nuances of sensitivity? and they did. They were open, tolerant of my ignorance. And now I can call myself after working with Andrea in the field and doing studies and not understanding the analysis, the statistical analysis, I can consider myself a kind of amateur epidemiologist. I was really drawn here by pioneers in health and human rights. Chris, who you've heard from, who started probably the first center of public health and human rights in a school of public health. By Bob Lawrence, who has now retired, but who was a pioneer in the field and one of the founders of Physicians for Human Rights. And he too he spent most of his career here. Mike Clegg, who was willing to take a risk on a lawyer in an epidemiology department, as well as David Celentano and now Shruti, who thinks that's okay. That's okay. And that vision that Mike had, and Al Summer, who I'm so thrilled is here today, had before Mike, is really what enabled me to be here in the first place. And the support I've had is really remarkable. I'm not sure how much people knew that I was running an advocacy coalition out of the school. But if they did know, they never complained. And I did some controversial things, and including speaking out on Gaza, and never once was I told, can you tone it down? Not once. So that support has been remarkable. And my colleagues who spoke, Susanna really was my teacher and my colleague. And through all the difficult times at Physicians for Human Rights, we worked things out together. And ever since, I still consult her, consider her my tutor in advocacy, in media, in human rights, and I'll be forever grateful. And Rohini was modest. Yes, she was a mentee, but she's now probably the most published person in the world on research on violence against healthcare and war. And while I did some editing, she was a person I asked to read a draft of my book, and she read it from beginning to end. And it was a better, I hope, book for her reading it. And Andrea's taught me field epidemiology when we went together to Ethiopia to look at problems of sexual violence in refugee camps there. And so she too has been a teacher. And there are so many others who have inspired me. One person not with us anymore, and students may never have heard of him, but I want to mention him because he was such a towering figure in this field, Dr. Jack Geiger. He led student demonstrations while he was in medical school against segregated hospitals affiliated with the University of Chicago and beat them. They got desegregated. He fought apartheid in South Africa. He went to the South during the Civil Rights Movement. And as a result of that, seeing the poverty and deprivation and lack of healthcare, started the first community health centers in the United States, now core institutions in our public health infrastructure. And it was people like him and so many others that have given me the inspiration and the guidance to do this work, especially in the dark times. And I want to mention my family. I'll come back. And I've been fortunate to work on the front lines with people dedicated to advance human dignity. And I've seen too, and I think this is so important, I've seen how public health has begun to really believe deeply that human rights is important to its mission. And I have a story I tell my students that they really can't believe about how human rights has changed public health. Back in the 1990s, when the AIDS epidemic in Africa was out of control, the consensus of public health was we should spend our resources on prevention and not on treatment. And it was unfortunate that millions of people might have to die, but that was the best approach. But some people didn't accept it. Activists like the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa went to the streets and the courts saying, we have a right to live and we have a right to health. And pioneers like Paul Farmer and Jim Kim challenged public health orthodoxy and said, people have a right to live and have antiretroviral drugs like people in the West have. That's accepted now. There's no debate. That's how far we've come, and that's what human rights has meant. Through all our defeats, all our disappointments, human rights and public health now go hand in hand. And I've tried to do my part in all this. Of course, as everybody has said, the accomplishments and the semi-accomplishments, resolutions without implementation, for example, is tempered by the fact that we're in one of history's terrible times. Contempt for public health, contempt for human rights, contempt even for people's survival. It's national policy. And I never thought I'd live to see a day when war crimes were considered an acceptable element of foreign policy, which it is today. And even more, I see around me my colleagues whose careers are under threat because they don't have funding for work they thought they were going to do for a lifetime. And even more, the people and communities they serve who are suffering from this abandonment of global health, of humanitarian needs, and of any form of justice. But I think we know that while the road is a long one, and Tom Paine, the great pamphleteer of the American Revolution, said, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. And our history, we often forget that our history is a history of slavery, of Jim Crow, that it took 100 years to outlaw lynching, 100 years to outlaw lynching. And all those times, there's new scholarship, I love reading history, scholarship of the activists in the pre-slavery, pre-Civil War period, who were on the barricades, not only for abolition, but for equal rights for Black people. That wasn't known, but they were out there fighting. And we know people in incredibly difficult situations. I remember, and he's in my book, Dr. Iyad Siraj, a Palestinian psychiatrist who was the founder of the Gaza Community Mental Health Center, working in an impossible situation, under assault from Israelis, not being able to speak freely in Gaza, and persevering. And I've met so many of people. One of the photos you may have seen was me with two women in a library. Those two women were activists seeking the release of illegally detained medics, illegally detained and imprisoned by Russia. These are their families, and they are not giving up. Rohini mentioned Myanmar. The doctors were the leaders of the civil disobedience movement. Almost 1,000 of them were arrested, and they still work and persevere. And there was a picture of the Minister of Health of the Central African Republic, who at one point put his life on the line to prevent a hospital from being attacked. So I think we have to take that into account and use them, not only the scientists and the activists, as role models for us today, that knowing how this road is a long one. And another of my heroes is W.E.B. Du Bois, who was, apart from being an incredible civil rights leader in very difficult times in the 1920s and 30s, he was also a leader in social science. 100 years ago, he published a major work of social science, which is still a model today. And he said, what's required was dogged work and striving. I think that's our task. And everybody asks me, are you really retiring? And I say, yes, but. And the but is fairly capitalized. So I am going to remain involved, and I'm going to work with all of you, so many in the room and on Zoom, or my colleagues, my friends, to continue this fight, and we will just do it together. Thank you.
So please join us at the reception.